It happens every June 1st. For the next 6 months, we watch the weather in the Atlantic for any sign of an impending threat. And now we find ourselves in another Atlantic hurricane season that's expected to have above normal activity. In Met offices, weather stations, and newsrooms around the world, the activities in the tropics are always on radar. The hurricane season has started, and that means all the lessons we have learned in past storms, new technology, and advanced warning systems are being put to the test. And for now, all we can do is wait. Yet for all the planning, the unpredictability and erratic behavior of these forces of nature can ultimately leave us very vulnerable. Hello and welcome to On the Record. I'm Jerome Sawyer, and in this edition, we go inside the National Emergency Management Agency to see what it's like getting ready for one of the toughest jobs in the country.
When I came over and I lost communication, and my friend was sending me live footage, and I turned to my wife and told her, I say, this is it. I'm going as soon as the storm clears. And I was only 14 in Hurricane Andrew. We know what it's like to need help, Spanish well, so we formed together a committee within days or in hours, and off we went. And here we are, we're still here today.
Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits, venture into unknown territory, take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV, cable channel 212, and streaming live on Facebook. board a U.S. Navy Black Hawk helicopter Wednesday morning bound for Marsh Harbor, accompanied by a team from ABC World News and other U.S. Armed Forces personnel. From the heat, close quarters, and virtually little view of the outside, it's soon very clear this would be no luxury adventure. Once on the ground in Marsh Harbor, we make our way over to the U.S. aid camp. More than 50 volunteers from the Fairfax County Urban Search Team have set up base camp here.
So one of the remarkable things about this response is that the United States military airlifted 95,000 pounds of all this cargo over here to Abaco from Nassau. And that was over the course of about a day and a half to 2 days. And so that allowed us to set up our base of operations here with all our search and rescue equipment and all our base camp equipment so we could get out into the areas around Abaco. We've been working with NEMA. They've been coordinating response. We have nightly response coordination meetings, and so we get their priorities because they're the ones that are coordinating the entire response, and then we execute their priorities based on what they tell us.
U.S. aid is working along with the U.S. military to get to the Keys and across Abaco Island and provide crucial data to NEMA and the government.
Because us just going around asking if everybody's okay doesn't really provide any value if we don't get that back. So we do an assessment on nearly every building we come upon, just a quick sort of stoplight, red, yellow, green, red being significantly destroyed, yellow being moderately destroyed but repairable, and green being minor destroyed with just some minor repairs to fix. And so we do that for every building we come across. But in addition, we're talking to people. So what are their humanitarian needs? Do they need food, water, shelter, medicine? And then working with the Bahamians to make sure they understand, okay, this person's going to be good for another 5 days, another 10 days. So they have those priorities. And so obviously somebody that needs medicine today is much higher priority than someone needs medicine 5 days from now. So it's prioritizing that and getting that information back to the Bahamian government.
In a storm, preparation is key. And the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, that preparation began months ago. This year, however, I want to send the message to the nation that we are all NEMA. You, me, we. In mid-May, NEMA held Operation Restore Island Keys, an exercise designed to test our ability to coordinate a nationwide response to a catastrophic hurricane. Supported by U.S. Northcom, 3 personnel serve as exercise controllers. They got to conduct the exercise, provide scenario injections, and even provide simulation support. For several days, NEMA and partners simulated a Category 5 hurricane, tracing the path of Hurricane Matthew a few years ago.
We came about back in 1992 when Hurricane Iniki came through Hawaii, and the senator there, Senator Inouye, said, hey, there's a lot of capabilities out there that DoD has. Why can't we find ways to use some of those to help with disasters? So that's where we started. We've come a long way since then. In fact, you know, we have the name Pacific Disaster Center, and you might ask, why are we over here? We are global. We're throughout the world. We have a system called DisasterWare that tracks disasters throughout the world. We have the largest humanitarian disaster response database in the world within that system, which is free for emergency managers worldwide to use. We don't charge for the use of that. And then as far as getting involved in the Bahamas, it started about 20 years ago with my boss, Dr. Aaron Huey, who came here and did some work actually with the PS. Obviously, he wasn't the PS at the time, Carl Smith, in standing up NEMA and starting the plans and things here for NEMA in the Bahamas. And so we've had a pretty special relationship with the Bahamas. A lot of what we do now is it's funded through U.S. Northern Command. So they ask us to come out and help. And so I'm the exercise lead for Pacific Disaster Center. So I do all the exercises for us. Obviously, we also have something here called a National Disaster Preparedness Baseline Assessment that we've been doing. We started that in June of 19. It's extended a little longer than we want, but no one expected Dorian or COVID either. So we're hoping to finish that up by the end of the summer. And that is a look throughout the country, including the islands, on disaster preparedness. And we don't just give you a report, but we sit down and say, okay, here are some things we think that you can do. What do you think, right? We sit down and say, let's come up with a 5-year plan that we can improve disaster preparedness throughout the country, right? Not just here in New Providence, but on every island. So we have lots of projects that we've been involved with here.
One of the takeaways was this issue of what's called malicious compliance.
A lot of times what happens, and I have to quote, it's one of our guys at PDC who used the term, Adam Graman, but It's dangerous because a lot of times if people aren't comfortable in what they're doing, they don't understand their job, and they have a plan put in front of them, they're going to do only exactly what the plan says. They're not going to do other things that are going to be required. They're not going to change things that maybe they shouldn't do based on the disaster. So the example I use is the plan says for an evacuation, move people to, say, point A. Well, if it's flooded between where you are and point A, you don't want to move those people, right? But someone who has a plan is going to say, well, either I'm going to move them anyway because the plan tells me to, or I'm just not going to move them because it's flooded, right? Instead of being able to think for themselves and say, all right, I know I have to get people there, or I have to get people evacuated. Maybe I move them to point B instead because I can't get to point A. Or maybe I find another means of transportation to get to point A. So that malicious compliance is not being comfortable in what you're doing and not having the ability to make your own decisions if it's not presented to you in the plan.
The training exercise is designed to guide and not dictate, and there's a good reason for that.
It's very hard for NEMA to write a plan that can come up with every scenario possible that could be out there. And so what we try to do, and I say we, I'm speaking for NEMA, but what NEMA tries to do in any plan, what you try to do, is provide guidance for people to be able to do their jobs. I look at it when I was an XO on a ship, very similar. It was, people did a much better job if I let them do their job than I sat there and tried to tell them how to do their job, right? So NEMA knows, the ESFs know what their jobs are. Let the ESFs do their job instead of NEMA providing a big list and say, this is everything I expect from you every day. It doesn't work that way.
Once a storm becomes a threat, there are 4 phases to activation.
The pre-activation really only works in hurricanes, right? When you have no notice events, there's really no pre-activation. So, but that pre-activation allows you to take all of those planning steps. It allows you to do all your communications checks. It allows you to go out and check all your shelters. Are our shelters ready to go? Do we have warehouses? Do we have supplies? How long will our gas supply last on the island, right? Because the storm's coming, I know I'm not getting the mailboat. How much food and water do we have on the island? So it allows you to do all of that preparation ahead of time. And you can now let NEMA know, hey, I only have 3 days food and water left because the mailboat was here 5 days ago. The mailboat's not going to be able to get down because of the path the storm is taking. I'm going to need food and water as soon as the storm passes in some way, right? Get it to me somehow. That's all pre-planning, right? That allows folks to know where you're going to need it. And then you have those initial phases where, okay, we now know the storm is definitely coming here, right? There's not a whole lot of variance in all those tracks we're looking at. It's coming over the archipelago some way, shape, or form. So now you start to go, okay, I know this is where it's going to affect. I know this is where I need my resources. I start to call in some of the ESFs and say, I need your help figuring this out. I need your help figuring this out. And then you go into that activation phase. The storm has now made landfall, or the storm is a certain amount out from landfall, and you say, okay, we're calling everybody in. We think it's going to be a big storm. And obviously, smaller storms, an Isaias, maybe that's going to glance. Maybe you don't need everyone, maybe, but it's still an activation. It's just not you're calling in every ESF. And then you have that full activation, which is a big storm. It's your category 3s, 4s, and 5s. It's your Dorians, your Matthews, your Joaquins, your larger ones that the Prime Minister says, this is definitely a national disaster. I need all hands on deck. And that's when you see mobilization outside of the NEOC. You see those ministries and agencies being tasked outside of the NEOC to provide support.
Hurricanes are classified by wind speed, but it is the water and the surge which inflict the most harm and damage. In recent years, the growing storm surge and flood waters have meant a change in strategy as well.
You can't classify it by water because you might get 12 inches of rain there, I might get 4 inches 2 miles down the road, and you might get 12 feet of storm surge and I might get 2. So you can never really, so you have to classify it by wind. But I've seen category 1s, I've seen tropical storms dump rain, and I'll give Houston as an example. 30 inches of rain were dumped in Houston. I think it was Allison or Harvey, and much worse than I've seen category 3s dump as far as water goes, right? So that's why you can't really categorize them by water. But water is definitely the danger. It's, like I said before, it doesn't take a whole lot of swift moving water to carry away a vehicle, let alone a person. And that's why we lose so many people in these storms. Storm surge comes in and it goes out, and it carries things and people with it when it goes out, right? Flood water, it stays, it's there for a while, and you start to get, not used to it, but you understand flooding. And you have a lot of flooding here, even just in thunderstorms. So people get used to that. But storm surge, and then you add the amount of rain that a storm can bring on top of it.
And as always, the building codes are the best defense.
I know when we're talking about East Grand Bahama, We're talking about building codes and things of that nature, right? We lost a lot of houses into the water because of that. So if you start to look at building codes, things of that nature, where you can start building things on stilts, right? You build elevated homes, especially near the coasts. You build away from the coast. You don't build in any of those erosion zones. You know, you have climate change. You never, you know, depending on what numbers you believe, in 50 years, how far up could the water come, right? So now you're even closer to the coast if you're building near the coast. So things like that are mitigation measures, what we call, right? You can never stop the water from coming, but you can mitigate the damage that it's going to cause. Building codes, seawalls, beach replenishments, there are lots of things you can do. I can't speak to exactly everything the Bahamas is doing. I know there are some projects ongoing that are doing things like that, but those are just things you have to take into account as you start to recover from these storms and start to rebuild and say, you know, let's figure out a way to build back better.
When we come back, NEMA's director speaks about lessons learned.
This season, yet again, like last season, has promised to be an above average one. And I will explain certain terminologies that you will hear along the way when referring to hurricanes as average, active, above average. But first, let me just do a reality check. We have up a map, the first map of United States, a plain map, showing United States, the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Bahamas. Now, this map has these countries represented on it. The second map, which is the same map, you will see. The second map that has hurricane tracks, storm tracks dating as far back as 1851 to 2019. Notice this is the same map, but this map is populated with all those storms that would have traversed that area, those countries that I mentioned from 1851 to 2019. What does it say? It says the Bahamas, we are in the middle of Hurricane Allen. As hurricanes are our realities, and every year this is what we face. So moving forward, we should be more than willing to prepare ourselves for the onset of the season.
Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits, venture into unknown territory. We take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV Cable Channel 212 and streaming live on Facebook on the R News Bahamas page.
What Dorian did was Dorian shifted our norm. The frequency of storms last year remained quite the same. However, Dorian, that one storm, changed the norm for us. No longer we just anticipating, okay, receiving some winds, say for about a minute or two, in excess of 100 miles per hour. But we're looking at now being impacted by winds in excess of 200 miles per hour, and the possibility of the storm affecting a particular area or island lasting for up to 48 hours. So our mitigation efforts should now be centered on mitigating against damages of winds in excess of 200 miles per hour and storm surges up to 30 feet. That's our new norm now.
To hear you say that, I literally had a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach just to hear you say that we're in this new norm.
NEMA is the agency responsible for coordinating the recovery efforts in any disaster. Yet hurricanes command the bulk of their resources and time. Their job is to coordinate, and that means knowing who goes where to do what, for how long, and everything in between. Captain Stephen Russell is the director of that agency. From their headquarters on Gladstone Road, they watch and ready a response, whatever that may be. Once a hurricane passes, the real work begins. Priority one is always the preservation of life, search and rescue. But shortly thereafter is the daunting task of damage assessments. One of the more misunderstood periods in the hurricane aftermath is trying to work out all the logistics.
One of our first tasks is immediately after an event. I try to get the Prime Minister and members of the Disaster Advisory Council, his cabinet colleagues, to quickly get to do an overview of the disaster impacted area. Get them that bird's eye view if they cannot get on the ground, but if they can't get on the ground, that's fine. But I want to get them a bird's eye view of the entire area that has been impacted. And then once they would have done that, they can start formulating some things in the mind based on information that they're receiving from the EOC as well. Then we would eventually send a damage assessment needs analysis team into the islands. These are specialists from the various ministry departments. The Ministry of Works, Environmental Health, utilities corporations, they would go into the islands and almost do a slow pace of the infrastructure, their utilities, their services. A team from Ministry of Works, they go and do the household inspection, looking at the condition of all of our houses. Similarly, the Department of Social Services, they would go through almost door to door, doing a social assessment of the composition of the household to see how they would fare, and then how we can best, once we have all that data into us, we find how best to assist that community. In the meantime, our ships, aircraft, they are getting initial relief supplies, food, water, and clothing. We're trying to shore up the shelters as best we can. So those are our priority activities that work along with an initial damage assessment or damage assessment needs analysis. A simple aircraft to transport goods to Inagua or to Meguana, they could probably take about 5-10 cases of water for us. And they can get there probably within an hour and a half. If you're going to transport by ship to get to Inagua, that's 22 hours. So we have to be mindful of the geographical makeup of the Bahamas and the timeline and getting your ships and your planes out to certain impacted areas.
And it's these kinds of training events which help to develop the response. But living in the past can be a helpful tool as well. Here's how. The situation following Hurricane Dorian became so hectic that a mid-air collision prompted some drastic measures.
Because of the nature of Hurricane Dorian, it did become a major problem. Again, life-saving search and rescue became our priority. And we allowed the Coast Guard to deal with that. They were dealing with that matter for us. And they said, hey, look, if these aircraft continue coming into the space while we're trying to operate, we're going to pull back. So we had to have members from the Civil Aviation Department come here, and persons have a desire to go into the disaster zone or to fly into the zone. They had to make a request. And they could not go in unless they got an approval from the Civil Aviation Authority to allow search and rescue to take priority before any other relief goes into the area. So with the Civil Aviation Department on board, based on their experience, we have that, I think we have that under control now.
After Hurricane Dorian, over 150 agencies came to assist in providing relief, technical assistance, and aiding in our recovery. NEMA had to manage them all. That experience taught them a different approach when it comes to receiving help.
With Hurricane Dorian, we saw in excess of probably 150 NGOs who registered to assist. And they were pressing to come into the country to show their flags and to do their work, to do what they do best. But it calls for pausing and coordinating to see what they really bring into the table, linking them up with an appropriate government ministry department, and then allowing them to do their work. Because the events may occur away from the capital, we try to link them up with our administrators and their committees in the respective islands. And it may not be a good linking as you wish, because some of them are aggressive and they want to do their own thing. But we have to try and from time to time bring them, check them and bring them in line. These are our goals and objectives. And we need you to work in tandem with us to achieve a common goal and not you doing your own thing or catering to a particular sector of people in the community. We work with the administrators. We ask anybody coming to your jurisdiction, they must check in with the administrator. And before they must get an approval from NEMA. Approval from NEMA to say they are authorized to come into the country. and to work in a disaster zone. Customs and immigration, we need to seek approval from customs and immigration to allow them to come into the area as well as to clear any goods they're coming. So we must have a working knowledge of who they are, and we must send an information on to the administrator, these persons are coming in your area to do a certain work. They go contrary to that, then we have a concern.
Yet these agencies can sometimes mislead the public into believing that our own emergency agency is not responding, when in fact they are.
We are all NEMA. Every government ministry department has a liaison officer assigned to NEMA, as you would have seen here. We are all NEMA, all ministry departments. In all the family islands, the administrator and her team, they are our core group in the islands. We are all NEMA. They are working on our behalf in a disaster or in their respective islands. That's in the Disaster Preparedness Act. The administrator, he or she, they are the co-chairs of the local committees in the islands. So they are our representatives in the island. Not to physically see Mr. Russell or Monco come into your island. They are working on our behalf in the islands.
Hurricane Dorian exposed so many vulnerabilities for NEMA, the last of which was up-to-date technology. Gail Outen-Munker, in 2 years since then, has been spearheading a technical renaissance.
So out of that came a platform in which we were able to connect with all of the family islands, where they would go onto the platform, they would be able to actually put in their situational reports electronically. Then it's all collated. So we are able to bring up maps where the Met Office would be able to share, so that the family of islands would be able to see actually the track of the storm. We can talk to them one-on-one, what's happening prior to, and maybe sometimes during the storm, depending on how their internet services are, because the reality is they do have problems sometimes with internet services, and they may have intermittent, but sometimes they can do it on their phones. So they can still keep that connectivity through their phones with us online. We're able to manage the entire EOC and the family of islands from another board that we would bring up, what we call a taskmaster, to see whether or not those tasks were completed, who's done what, and so we're able to communicate better with each other, talk to each other, maneuver, move around, and see, did this happen? Are we sure this amount of persons got to safety? Is this shelter still closed? Is this happening? So you can question, and then with that too, with our BNGIS section, they're able to pull up in the maps to say where all of our shelters are. If persons have to move, what are the storm surge like? Do we have to move them from one area to the next? In terms of evacuation, where the storm is being tracked, how could we facilitate those persons? So we look at where all of our infrastructure is, what's happening, whether or not there's damage, how do we, so in terms of planning, yes. All of the tools in which we have, it's beautiful. But then again, if communications go down, if the power goes out, if the generator breaks down, we have to always have what we call redundancies. The use of the VHF radios, the handheld radios, telephones. So we have to go back to what we know. Flip charts, because if you see over there, we have some flip charts, because in the midst of the whole exercise and using all of this beautiful technology, they said to us, everything went down. So we had to pull out the flip charts, pull out the whiteboards, and go back to what we know. Go back to the telephones, calling, seeing what is what, doing the radio checks through the police, because you know the police has a system, a trunking system, that they're able to reach every rock, nook, and cranny within the Bahamas. So they went and they did what they needed to do in terms of the communication and relayed the information back into the NAOC. And so that's what we talk about when we talk about coordination through the police, Royal Bahamas Defense Force. We work together as one unit. It's one voice, one response, many moving parts.
And here's where it gets challenging. Different agencies with sometimes competing priorities still have to be managed.
The biggest challenge is making sure that we get correct information coming into the NEOC so that you can brief the Prime Minister and his cabinet so that they can have information, so they can ask questions and we can deliver them what those solutions will be and give him solutions. So even with his, we have to also be able to know what he's going to potentially ask. So whatever it is that we're giving him, that information, because he's going to ask questions given to the information. Don't just give it to him. He wants to know what is the solution at the end of the day. How are you going to get this done? So we have to coordinate and work with ourselves to say, look, this is the situation, we're giving this to the PM. What is the solution that we're going to tell him at the end of the day? What are the suggestions we're going to give him? And then he and his cabinet will decide whether or not they're going to take that recommendation or those solutions in which we would, and it has to be several different types. It just can't be one. If A doesn't work, what happens to B, C, D, and E? And those are the challenges you have in terms of making sure that you have that correct information at all times. Always verifying that the information is correct.
Much like these storms that keep evolving into bigger and more dangerous monsters, NEMA has had to evolve as well, as painful as it may be at times.
We've evolved from working out of the bottom floor from I've been in cabinet office, or I should say from a hurricane desk, to a state-of-the-art EOC within the whole of the Caribbean. That is working from just with whiteboards and telephones and radios into now truly using the internet, all of the electronics that you can think of, connecting, and persons not working in silos. We have somewhat broken, we still have some silos, don't get me wrong, but we have broken for the most part some of those silos that people now connect. So they're connecting the dots, they see the big picture, and they see where they sit in that picture and how their roles actually work together in unison so that we can work together to achieve the one goal.
Coming up next, enforcing the law in a disaster, the first responders and peacekeepers.
Me, my 4 kids, my grandkids, and we was in Murphytown. And it was like after 11, the first one, my son, the air condition blowing, and he said, we have to get ready to go. And like minutes after, the roof started to come off. And all of us started to go to the next apartment. By the time we reached the next the apartment complex, their roof was already off. So we had to run to the next one. And the next one, that was off already. So everyone had to get together and try to get to a shelter. But at that point, all the roads and everything was already blocked up. So we had to try our best to clear whatever we could clear to make a path that we could to get through a shelter. But as we was passing to go to a shelter, the horrifiable situation we have seen, cannot forget it. It was horrible, because we are seeing so much. People was hollering and screaming. It's just like Judgment Day. Every shelter we went to was already destroyed. It was like Judgment Day. Everybody hollering and screaming, can't find nowhere to go. That experience, I wish that for no one. That was horrible.
So
I had my 6 months old young baby, my granddaughter, with us. But through it all, she was smiling that she gave us peace, knowing that we was running for our lives, but she's smiling. We find shelter by the government clinic. After we done been to 4 different shelters, then we find refuge at the government clinic, where we reside there. We had nothing, only God's grace.
Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits, venture into unknown territory, take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV, cable channel 212, and streaming live on Facebook.
I wish to once again brief the nation in the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian, which has left generational devastation across Abaco and Grand Bahama. I just returned from an initial air assessment flight on Grand Bahama, which was conducted on a U.S. Coast Guard helicopter. Much of Grand Bahama was previously underwater, but Grand Bahama is now cleared. Some homes, businesses, and other buildings and infrastructure were badly damaged. There are a significant number of people in shelters. When one review from the east, coming central, Sweetings Key and the eastern area had suffered quite a bit of damage to homes. Many were destroyed, roofs were disturbed, but what was most significant, those homes that were built on stilts were not damaged. As we moved into the Freeport area, I can report that the flooding had receded and most homes in Grand Bahama appeared to have received minor damage. Freeport infrastructurally had done well. However, from a humanitarian perspective, we must consider the psychological impact that we would experience at a later date.
There are a multiplicity of agencies involved in hurricane response. Police, as the chief law enforcers, will take the lead in the all-important communications.
That is coordinating communication and information coming in using our communication equipment. The Royal Bahamas Police Force has a trunking system. We're able to communicate via two-way radio. There's also, in the event of a fail, there's also satellite phones that Family Island commanders as well as persons in New Providence, they have access to communicate in a disaster.
Mm-hmm. And the other functions that you work?
Some of our other functions, so communication is the lead function, and some of the other functions include fire services. When you talk about shelter inspections, there's also search and rescue as our marine unit, as well as our mobile units and operation teams.
And you all are deployed before, during, and after, right?
Yes. So in the preparation mode, we have teams of officers who are deployed, and so the lead person for example, search and rescue, they'll coordinate that team, and that's land and marine. And then of course, in preparation for the storm, you have fire services who will coordinate and make sure that shelters are ready through their inspections.
And then afterwards, some of the key roles and functions.
Well, of course, our main function is to maintain law and order, and so that is during, prior, in the aftermath of the storm. We want to make sure that persons remain safe and that we're able to respond to acts of crime, reported acts of crime.
Within the NEMA facility, police receive information that will in turn help them to act.
As you would appreciate, if information comes into the center involving the police or communications, that information is directed to me. However, I may have persons in the center who play supporting roles to that function. And so I have a duty to involve them to ensure that that matter is dealt with in a timely manner.
Taking a prominent seat at the table for this exercise this year was the familiar and critical Royal Bahamas Defense Force.
It helps us with our ability to be able to use the platform to get the information that is coming into the EOC and be able to get that into our situation report so that NEMA is better able to make critical decisions or even in a better position to be able to brief our leaders on critical things that is happening within the country.
The Defense Force, as their name suggests, are the first line of defense. They must be on the ground before, remain there during, and are often the only rescue effort for days, maybe even weeks after.
It's very important for us to get our officers or Marines in the areas that we believe that may be impacted by a system. And the reason why I say this is because following a system, we may not be able to get those Marines in there in a timely manner. And also these Marines go into those islands. They go there to assist the administrators with preparation and preparing, getting those shelters ready, getting their EOCs ready, helping the administrators with logistics, decision making. So they play a critical role on those areas, and that is why we ensure that we get them there on the islands ahead of any impact. Being out there and being able to see, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force takes on many hats, customs, immigration, police, and so we're sort of used to taking on these roles. It's nothing strange to us when we execute our duties. We are the ones who signed up to do all the dirty work, and so the country expects us to do our job, and we can't go in an impacted area or in a situation saying that we can't do it because of X, Y, Z. We have to continue to look at what it is that we're trying to achieve and focus on that and do what it takes or do what it needs to be done in order to execute our duties.
Hurricane Dorian has been the standard by which all storms are now judged. And even these highly skilled, highly trained, experienced military had to reassess many of their disaster operational procedures post-Dorian.
To be honest, there was a lot of lessons learned in Dorian. We know that Dorian would have impacted the Bahamas, actually Abaco and Grand Bahama severely. And we learned that there's some things in our response that we needed to address. Equipment, there's some additional training in certain areas. So we would have identified all of these areas. We would have held an after-action review, and we would have gained from that the input of all of those individuals who were a part of the response teams, and we would have tried to build upon those and find which areas that we needed to improve on, and how do we go about improving in those areas. I can truly say that coming out from Dorian, our Commander Defense Force has established 2 new units. They're called the Crisis and the Disaster Management Units. The Disaster Management Unit is the one that I spearhead, and we would have spent the last year formulating plans and standard operational procedures that can be instituted within the organization. And we would have tweaked our hurricane response plan that we use to disseminate throughout the organization. So we've been busy over these past few months. We've also required some additional equipment. We've held training after training. So far, the crisis and disaster management units would have trained over 200 plus personnel. We just would have completed a training yesterday, and this is ongoing. We're going to try and train up as much persons within the Royal Bahamas Defense Force in disaster management training. So we've been very busy.
But their efforts are not in isolation. As a member of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, also known as SEDEMA, the Defense Force and others benefit from nearby expertise.
The Bahamas is one of the 19 participating states under the SEDEMA umbrella. So working together with our counterparts is nothing new. Defense Force actually is a military. And so during trade winds, we would have trained with some of these people. Trade winds is a regional exercise held every year. We would have trained with some of these persons. This is nothing new. This is something that we do every year. And we continue to build and strengthen relationships with our regional partners. So I would say during Dorian, it was a learning experience, though I think it was the first time we've actually had militaries come into the Bahamas to assist. We had the Jamaica Defense Force, and then we had the Trinidadians, and also we had assistance from the RSS in the Caribbean. So they was instrumental in helping us. Police would have worked alongside of the teams from the RSS, and so we had no complaints there.
Ahead in this edition of On the Record, Social Services talks about the new realities created by these big storms.
We rode out the storm in Grand Bahama Highway. It's a part of Pine Ridge, and the it was terrifying. Well, to see the water rush inside the house so quickly, and what we had to go through those couple of days was just terrifying, thinking you were about to die. Yeah.
So the water started, did it rush in all at once or it just started rising bit by bit?
Well, at first when we woke up, it was like almost, it was filling up the porch.
Mm-hmm.
And by the
This
time...
was what, Sunday?
This was like Monday morning.
Monday morning, okay. Mm-hmm.
And by the time we took up clothes and stuff to try and get out, the water was already inside the house.
Wow.
So yeah.
So you couldn't leave?
We couldn't leave.
So what did you decide to do then?
We tried to get out in my father's trailer head because he drives trailers. And it stalled out, so we couldn't get out. So we just decided to pack up some stuff because we thought, like, we just thought for the worst, but we was, I don't know, like, it was just terrifying. Like, the moment, we wasn't expecting it, and...
So you packed up some stuff.
Yeah.
You couldn't leave.
Our important stuff, we couldn't leave.
And so what did you do with that?
We packed the important stuff and put in the roof in case something should happen. And we waited a little bit because we didn't think the water was going to come up that high. And afterwards, when we realized the water was coming up so high, because most of us in the house couldn't swim, it was 17 of us and a baby.
17 of you and a baby.
Yes, sir. And when the water came up close to my chest, we started putting the children up, the younger ones up first, and my Grammy and my granddaddy.
Up in the roof?
Yes, sir.
In the attic now.
And I tried to contact the people, and they told us they were coming, but no one came. After we went in the roof, my two uncles went up to Gold Rock. They swam up to Gold Rock, and they tried to get help, and the people started shooting at them. So, yeah, and they had to swim back. So we were fighting the storm and people also.
Every new season of On the Record, we push the limits. Venture into unknown territory. We take our cameras into places unseen before. We share the stories and experiences that affect us all. And now it's time for Season 5. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on RTV Cable Channel 212 and streaming live on Facebook on the R News Bahamas page. We had heard that McLean's town was ground zero for Grand Bahama. If it isn't, it's a close second. The imagery is startling. The area, a wasteland. Mounds of debris greet you on both sides of the road. Destroyed and badly damaged vehicles litter the landscape. Most homes are blown apart. The furniture which once belonged inside these homes now lay damaged, broken, and unusable. Government buildings, schools, businesses all bear the markings of 200+ mile-per-hour winds. Few homes are inhabitable. The only sounds are heavy equipment and clearing debris. Every storm produces a human toll. It varies from lives lost to displacement and damage to various physical and mental illnesses. This is where the role of the Department of Social Services becomes so important. No wonder a preparedness exercise must include this agency.
The work that we do in the Department of Social Services is very critical. The first thing is that we are the lead agency within NEMA. In the NEOC, the Emergency Support Function 6 is responsible for mass care and shelters. That is our charge. Naturally, that is what we do. We take care of all those that have a need, a social need specifically, throughout the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And so, as the lead in that team, prior to a disaster happening, we bring together our support agencies and complete and conduct shelter inspections throughout New Providence. The Family Island administrators, along with their disaster committee teams, would conduct those same type of inspections on the various family islands, but we do have an officer from the Department of Social Services within those islands attached to that committee.
Each island has its own shelters, and with that comes its own set of challenges.
Well, the challenges are many. Common challenges would be finding the manpower to manage those shelters. And it's simply because as time goes on, people move away, people become exhausted, overwhelmed, people become victims of the storms themselves. And so it is always a challenge in keeping trained shelter managers going. But with the partnership of NEMA and USAID, we have engaged in ongoing shelter management training every year. Last year would have made it difficult because of COVID-19 protocols. And what we would have done last year is we partnered with IOM to put on an online camp coordination, camp management training, which is a step up from shelters because it deals with mass shelterees or evacuees. And so we were able to train people in New Providence and throughout the Family Islands with that. This year, USAID has done a pilot program where they trained instructors to do virtual shelter management training, of which I'm one of those instructors. And they would have launched their first training last month.
As storms grow in size and intensity, so do the threats to people in coastal communities. Hurricane Irma necessitated evacuations in southern islands. Prior to that, Matthew showed the vulnerability to even New Providence residents in the south. But again, it was Dorian who stretched the limits of our emergency response as thousands evacuated hurricane-ravaged zones for days following the storm, now adding another component to the emergency response plan.
The first thing it tells us is that we need to have trained shelter managers within those facilities. And I say that because during the trainings, there are simulations that take us to role play certain variables. And so when you have a trained shelter manager in place, that manager is now aware that there are a number of difficulties and challenges that can be faced. They would have already gone through certain simulations that would prepare them for addressing those needs and challenges. And so it is very important to make certain that that is done. Secondly, it's very important to make certain that you are prepared. So with all the mitigation of getting your equipment, your tools, making certain that your staff or your volunteers are briefed properly, that they're aware of what the circumstances can be, is also very helpful. Typically 72 hours, which is a short-term shelter stay, is what we would have experienced in the past. Now that we have situations where people need to be evacuated from islands and come into a more safe space, we've recognized over time that there is a need to do a little bit more. And so last year, Poinciana Inn was one of the places that was enlisted by the department to temporarily house those people that came in that had to make extended stays within the shelters. And so as the storms evolve, our services obviously have to evolve. The Department of Social Services also has a temporary housing program ongoing. It's a part of our normal work. And so people who would have come and had to have left the shelter for whatever reasons were also placed within those temporary housing systems. We also had situations where the department would have assisted families or individuals in purchasing airline tickets to transport them to another family island where they may have had family or loved ones and friends that agreed to take them in. And so we would have assisted in that way as well.
Every year we use this time to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Last year, we escaped without incident. But as the season kicks off, the need for preparation looms larger. We hope our program this evening has given some insight into just some of the preparations and hopefully will cause you to begin some of your own. Special thanks to all the agencies that make up NEMA and allowing us access to their training. Until next time, thanks for watching On the Record.